Chapter 16, Sex, Gender, and Personality. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at sex differences in personality. Okay, it's one of the more controversial topics in personality research, which we'll talk about a little bit first. The questions that they're looking at. Are men and women basically different or the same when it comes to personality? Are there inherent differences in personality between men and women? Have differences, if anything, if any, been exaggerated because of stereotypes? Right? So if they do find differences, are they made bigger because of stereotypes that we would hold for a male or for a female? And then what theories provide the best explanations for sex-linked features of personality? So there are some differences that research has found repeatedly. What theories might provide an answer for that? There's some key terms here. Sex differences, average differences between men and women on certain characteristics, such as height, fat distribution, personality characteristics, whatnot. Okay, gender, different, the social and cultural interpretation of what it means to be a man or a woman. Sex, whether an individual is biologically considered male or female or intersex. Okay, so again, we are looking at sex differences in personality. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means within all of this shortly. So the first section that we're going to cover in this video, the science and politics of studying sex and gender. Okay, so the science and the politics of it. So why is it a heated topic? Why it's definitely definitely raises contention among many different groups. And why is that? And how is that being resolved, if at all? Okay. So the study of sex differences is controversial. Some worry that finding sex differences might be used to support political agendas or the status quo. Okay, so if you find sex differences that say men are better at this or females are better at this, well, it may be used to say, okay, well, females are better caretakers, therefore they should be engaged, they should pursue this career path. Or men are better at this and this, so therefore men are better leaders, so they should be in leadership or management positions. Just basically finding differences that might reinforce stereotypes. Okay. Some argue that finding sex differences merely reflect gender stereotypes rather than real differences. Sex differences do exist, consistent across studies, and pretending they don't is out of touch with reality. So that's the argument of Eagly. She's a feminist psychologist, and she's saying there are differences, and we can't just ignore them or pretend that they don't exist because we don't want to upset people. We need to face it head on and take a look at what's there. Other psychologists argue that any discovery of sex differences merely reflects biases of scientists rather than objective reality. Another argument there. So some advocate stopping research on sex differences because findings of sex differences might conflict with ideas of egalitarianism. So back and forth on that. We should argue, we should continue researching it, we should give it up. Another reason why we should give it up is some people say that the differences are so small, it's not worth the time and energy to look into it because these differences are so small. The counter argument of that is if there's a very small difference between males and females on one particular aspect across a lifetime, that will make a big difference, right? Or perhaps there's very small differences on several factors. Well, several small differences add up. That's their argument, okay? Limitation of personality research is that research in personality has traditionally focused on differences between heterosexual, cisgender males and females. We're about to find out in the next slide or two that personality research used to just look at males, heterosexual, cisgender males, and that's all they looked at. And even when the females were in the studies, they weren't considered as a different anything. They were just put in the group, right? So a little while later, for reasons we will talk about in just a moment, they realized, okay, now we have to start including females and include a lot more females in the research. So that is one change that has happened. Another limitation is that personality research has paid little attention to gender and sexual diversity. Sex and gender has been viewed as binary this whole time. Variations in sexual orientation and identity have been unaccounted for. They haven't even considered it. They've just been looking at males and females, heterosexual. This is changing. The research community is increasingly aware that sexual orientation and gender identity is more variable than once assumed. So it is changing. There is research starting to be done in that area, including that area in the research. It's coming. It's coming. So, history of the study of sex differences, like I said, prior to 1973, women were not included. They used males only. And when they did use females, they didn't look at the differences in the data between the sexes at all. Women were just included the same as males, right? But in 1974, Maccabee and Jacqueline, they published The Psychology of Sex Differences. This was huge, okay? So what they did was they reviewed hundreds of studies and they drew conclusions on how men and women were different. Now, this was before meta-analysis came along, okay? So they just gathered hundreds of studies and they read through them and put them in their different piles and drew conclusions based on the method at that time. And what they did find is that women slightly higher than men in verbal. That's what this is, right? Women higher than men in verbal. Men higher than women in math and spatial. Okay? Personality, only one difference is that males are more aggressive than females. It's the only personality difference that they found. The conclusion was sex differences are few in number and trivial in importance. Okay, so they're saying there's really not a big difference between men and women. A little bit here, a little bit there, but trivial. Okay, but what this book did do was set off an avalanche of research on sex differences. So researchers everywhere saw this. They saw that there's, potentially differences between men and women. So there was this surge of research on this topic. After that, research had to calculate sex differences and include women in research. So the rules changed. Okay? Call for greater inclusion of women in personality research. And the other thing that happened is that this study had psychology develop a more rigorous, objective way of summarizing vast amounts of research, which we know now as meta-analysis. Okay, so it developed more precise quantitative procedures for examining conclusions across studies. It's a statistical method for calculating and summarizing data from a large number of studies. Okay, it's more objective. You can calculate how big the difference is. Because imagine you have 100 different studies of males and females measuring personality traits, and you are trying to read through and calculate, probably at this time, pencil and paper, right? What the difference is, how they're similar, how they're different. Okay, it's pretty subjective. We needed a more rigorous method. So they came out with that. Calculations of effect size. Okay, so effect size is how large are the sex differences. The effect size of something is how large are the differences between the two groups, right? So effect size, it's called a D statistic. It expresses the difference in the standard deviation of units, which is going to make sense down here. Okay, so standard deviation is variation of scores from the mean. So let's say that right here is the mean. Okay. Okay, let me say this a different way. Let's say that the average for this class on the test was 70. Okay, the average is 70, but that doesn't tell us, did everybody get between 65 and 75? Is everybody kind of in the same range? Or is the average 70 and some people got 90 and some people got 10? Right? So standard deviation tells us how much or less are all the scores spread from the mean. And it's important to know that. Okay, so effect size can be calculated for each study of sex differences and then averaged across the studies to give a more precise and objective assessment of if they're different and by how much. So they do a calculation, which you don't need to know the formula for that. But when they do the calculation and they tell you that the effect size of something is 0.2, it's got a D point score of 0.2. That's a small difference. It's not significant. If something has an effect size of 0.5 or negative 0.5, that's a medium difference. Now you're starting to talk about something that's worth looking at. And then, of course, 0.8 is very large. The reason they'll have 5 or negative 5 is, for example, if you are comparing women and men and it's 0.20, then that's in the direction of males. If it was negative 0.20, that would be in the direction to the left, which would be females, or whatever item was on the left. Okay, so here's another little diagram here that shows effect sizes. So this top one is an effect size of 0.2. So let's say that males are the blue and females are the red. So you can see there's the mean scores for males, mean scores for females. The difference is not much, right? It's a very small difference. A effect size of 0.5, which you can see here is a medium. That's worth looking at. Look at the difference. Males, their mean score is here, and females' mean score is here. So that's starting to suggest that there is an actual difference in performance or in personality or in something between males and females. If you have an effect size of 0.8, now look at it. That's a very large difference. If these were math scores or scores on extroversion or whatever the item is, you can clearly see that there is a difference between the blue and the red. Okay, and then effect size of 2.0 is just huge. Okay, so to remember is the meaning of the D scores of the effect sizes. Is it a strong effect? Is it a medium effect, or is it a small effect? So in comparing men to women, this part I already said. If it's a positive, indicate that men score higher than women. It depends on which side of where you place the data, right? A D score of negative 0.85 means that women score much higher in a particular trait. It's also really important to know that even if there's a large effect size for the average sex difference, does not necessarily have implications for one individual. Okay, so if there's a large effect size for, let's say this one, throw a ball. So physically throw a ball, right? That's 2. That's huge. It does not mean that there's women out there that can't throw the ball further than a man. It does not mean that at all. It just means that overall, as a group, the average is that men can throw the ball farther than women. Here's this one for GPA, which is almost hitting that medium mark for women being higher. Verbal, women slightly higher. One that is somewhat consistently found is spatial rotation ability, which is 0.73, which is quite high. So the way they describe that is spatial rotation ability is, I guess the easiest is, let's say, football, okay? So if I'm standing here, the quarterback, and I've got the football, and there's my player running from the left side to the right side of the field, I can throw the ball to the exact spot where that person is going to be at the time they're going to get there, right? So they liken that to, probably from an evolutionary standpoint, hunting, okay? Because if you were going to throw a spear or do anything to be catching prey, that would be an important skill to have, and that's a skill, that's a role that traditionally the males would have. Okay. But research overall has found that men and women on most measures of cognitive ability are the same. Sort of a recap on people's views of looking at sex differences, okay, so amongst people, but amongst psychologists. So a minimalist position say that the differences are small, they're inconsequential, we don't need to be looking at this. Any of these differences, they're not going to have consequences for our everyday lives. It's sort of a waste of time. We should be looking at things that are more important. Whereas the maximalists say that the size of sex differences should not be trivialized. It is small, but that can have a huge impact on people over a lifetime. And many of these differences are in the moderate range, and they all add up to a larger difference. So yes, maybe they're small, but they do add up, and we should be looking at them. Okay? And that is the end of section 1. Next one we'll be looking at is sex differences in personality, and I will see you in the next video.